Thanks very much for joining us today for this first 100 days event on the immigration record of the Trump administration to date. My name is Doris Meissner. I'm a senior fellow here at the Migration Policy Institute, and I'd like to welcome those who are here with us in the room, as well as tell you and the live stream audience that we're live streaming. And so welcome to the live stream audience as well. For people that are on the live stream, when we get to the Q&A period, you can tweet questions to @migrationpolicy. You can use the hashtag MPIDiscuss, or you can email to events@migrationpolicy.org. You have a handout on your, or that I think you could pick up on the way in, that gives a brief summary record of what we're talking about today, that takes us from the executive orders and other actions to current developments, and that is also available online for those who are listening from other parts of the country. Well, 100 days. 100 days has become a traditional marker for leadership, not only of presidents of countries, but presidents of colleges, universities, other beginnings of one sort or another. So it's an opportunity to take stock and to look at what's happened, and it's become a real way of assessing the effectiveness and the success of new leaders. So for a new administration, this particular 100 days falls, I believe, on Saturday, and therefore I think we can expect this week to be full of 100 days kinds of discussions. So we decided we would just start right off on Monday with the one that we wanted to have here on the immigration record of the Trump administration. Now, I think it's particularly important and relevant to be talking about this for this presidency because of the very central role that immigration played in the campaign and in the basic premises that drove this candidacy and helped to lead to the election of the president. So what we're seeing, I think, is that the campaign promises that were made on immigration have been a critical and driving playbook for what it is the administration has done. And that's what we want to look at. We want to look at those campaign promises, how it is that they are in fact being carried out. And so our aim today is to do a very broad tour across a lot of issues, what's happened, perhaps as or more important, what does it really mean? And then, of course, we will naturally be doing some projecting of where it might be going in the future. For that, we have a really superbly qualified panel. I'm very glad for the people that have agreed to join us here. First, you have read their speaker biographies, so I won't go into any real detail, but our first guest, of course, is my colleague, Muzaffar Shishti, who is the director of the MPI office at NYU School of Law. Then on my right, Julie Myers-Wood, who was the head of ICE in a prior administration and knows not only immigration enforcement, but Justice Department and law enforcement issues very well, both in government service as well as in the private sector. And finally, Stuart Verdery, who also served in an enforcement post, an important enforcement post in the prior Department of Homeland Security, Assistant Secretary for Policy and Planning. So with these three speakers, we're going to try to hit the big points from the standpoint of an overview, as well as interior enforcement and border enforcement. Then we'll do a little bit of exchange between us on other points that may not have yet been raised. And then, of course, we'll go to audience Q&A as well as Q&A from the live stream audience. So with that, I'm going to ask my colleague Moose to begin with really with an overview of what's happened, looking broadly at the issues and making a few comments, if you can, along the way on what your assessment of them are, what your assessment of this broad overview record really is.
Great, thank you, Doris. And let me just really do this as quickly as I can. because we have obviously two highly qualified speakers to talk about how this thing actually works in reality from their experiences in the prior Bush administration. So first, I think Doris said the most obvious thing, that compared to a lot of other policy agendas that the president campaigned on in the election, immigration was a cornerstone of his campaign. A lot of people would argue that he might have gotten elected because of his heavy emphasis on the immigration agenda. It was also one of the policy agendas that had much more specificity in the campaign than on many of his other policy agendas. It was a reasonably well-informed agenda from a certain playbook that he came to the campaign on. I think as he was inaugurated, it also became clear that he was rolling out elements of his immigration policy with much more speed and succession than he had on many other policy agendas. And so you saw in very rapid fire a number of executive orders covering everything from border to the interior enforcement, coming within about 2 or 3 weeks of his becoming president. I think it's safe to say that his most controversial, though it was not the very first order that he issued, was on suspending the entry of nationals of certain countries and creating a pause for refugee admission for 120 days, sort of generally spoken to in the broad media world as the travel ban. It really wasn't a travel ban. You would really call it was a sort of restriction and suspension of entry of nationals of certain countries and about refugee admissions. And it's ironic that the president did hit his first wall on the issue of immigration. And it was like series of courts all across the country, Republican appointed, Democratic appointed judges who said the president did not have authority to do what he did on those executive orders. And from that, I think there was somewhat of a conception formed that the president's orders have more noise than they have bite. And I think it's part of our job today in the 90 minutes to see that it is a misplaced assumption about the series of things that have happened in this administration. A lot of stuff has happened, both in direct terms and in perceived terms, which I think are making a strong footprint of this administration. And the lasting impact of those footprints, I think, will be felt over a period of time. We have yet to see the full impact of that. But let me just start with the ban on the entry of nationals of certain countries and the pause on refugees. This was the January 27th issued executive order, and it focused on nationals of 7 countries, restricted their admission to the United States, and also paused the admission of refugees for 6 months, and for Syrian refugees for forever. And it asked also for strong vetting mechanisms to be placed by various agencies for the admission of people entering the country. Now, that was immediately challenged in series of lawsuits, and many of the courts, the most prominent one became the federal court in the state of Washington, which enjoined the temporary restraining order. That was quickly taken to the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit affirmed temporary restraining order, and that did not go into effect. The president, instead of appealing that, decided that he was going to rescind that order and issued a new order on March 6th of 1917, which again placed restrictions on nationals of Iran, Libya, Somalia, Syria, Sudan, and Yemen on the issuance of both immigrant and non-immigrant visa. Compared to the prior policy, it exempted lawful permanent residents and allowed people who had earlier visas issued to be entered, and still case by case sort of grant of visas to people who showed good cause for entry. Most importantly, it took Iraq out of the 7 initial countries. It took permanent residents out of the countries, and it also removed the preference for minorities in the issuance of refugee visas, as had been in the prior order. But a good chunk of what you would call the first order remained in place. And legal actions were taken against that order immediately. And many lawsuits around the country, numerous of them, challenged the executive order. About three of them have need to be particularly mentioned. One was federal district court in Maryland, one was federal district court in Hawaii, one was federal district court in Virginia. Two of those said that granted the injunction against the order, and a court in Virginia, Maryland and Hawaii decided to grant injunction. The court in Virginia thought that the president had the authority to do what he did in the executive orders. Now, all the two orders, both Virginia and Maryland, are on appeal. The Maryland court to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the argument of that is being scheduled for the en banc court on May 8th, and the argument in the Ninth Circuit from the Hawaii case is going to be argued on May 15th before a panel judge. And the Third Circuit and the third decision, the Virginia case, it still be the original court. We don't know how that will play out. But obviously you begin to see there is a split potentially in the various Supreme Courts, and it's in almost all likelihood this case will land up at the Supreme Court, and probably will land up on the same schedule as we had the U.S. versus Texas case of the DACA and DAPA executive orders. Now, how the Supreme Court obviously is going to rule on this is everyone's guess. None of us should speculate on how the Supreme Court is going to rule on any of these issues. The only thing I would add here is that to the extent there's any indication of how the Supreme Court thinks about that, the last decision we had is the U.S. versus Texas case, which was, as all of you know, 4-4 decision. And given 4-4 decisions have a huge sort of a problem attached to them, is that we don't know how the 8 Supreme Court judges ruled on what basis. So that's an opaque set of opinions which we will not be able to discern. So we don't know how the 8 judges feel on the issue of both standing of states to bring these lawsuits and on the president's authority. And we certainly don't know how Judge Gorsuch is going to play out. This is a very different court. So frankly, we'll have to just wait out. But most likely we will not hear that till next summer. I think it's most likely going to follow the same schedule. Now, this is because of the halt of the decisions by the executive orders on the entry. There has been sort of a misconception that not much else has happened in immigration world, but huge amount has happened. We have an executive order on the border, which we will talk a little more in detail, and will be subject of a lot of discussion this week, because there is a provision in it for building of the wall, which is going to affect the budgetary process and potentially be a very critical factor in deciding whether the federal government continues to function after March or no. But important, the executive order I want to focus a little more on is on the interior enforcement. It was also issued on January 25th. There were implementing memos issued on February 20th by the Secretary. And they do 2 or 3 very, very important things which have long-term and immediate consequences in the daily lives of immigrants in the United States. First of all, the world of priorities that we had come to know, certainly towards the end of the Obama administration, is no longer that world. Essentially, the administration decided to broaden the categories of people who can be removed from the United States. I think if you take Secretary Kelly's statement of a week ago on face value, I think he was most honest about it when he said that the focus still is on criminal aliens, but in the spectrum of criminality where we decide to put our emphasis has changed, which means we're no longer going to focus necessarily on people who have committed violent crimes or of national security concern, but persons of all criminal record are now priorities. Second most important thing is that if we are pursuing a criminal foreign national, but in the process of getting him, we also encounter non-criminals who are unauthorized, they have also become a priority. Essentially, therefore, everyone is a priority in the new post-executive order realm. We have had strong indications about penalties that will be meted out to sanctuary cities. These are jurisdictions which are seen as non-cooperative with the federal government. And the Attorney General Sessions has now made it clear that Section 1373 of the 8 U.S.C. will now be the point through which we will determine whether some jurisdiction is in compliance with federal law to make them eligible for holding back federal funds, certainly from the Department of Justice. And in its most current form, last Friday, a letter was issued to our 9 jurisdictions around the country, asking them to show evidence whether they are in conformity with Section 1373. And if they don't show that evidence, the assumption is that federal funds will be withheld from those jurisdictions. There's also provisions for hiring 10,000 more ICE officers, for expanding the Section 287G programs under which states and local law enforcement authorities take on some function of the federal government. So all these actions have already taken place, and they are in various stages of implementation as we speak. One more important element of this, which should not get unnoticed, is that there is a huge element of collection and dissemination of data component to these executive orders. There'll be data collected and disseminated on non-citizens who are in federal prison, on non-citizens who are apprehended for being removed, and on jurisdictions which do not cooperate with the federal government. These are monthly reports and weekly reports issued, and special departments have been created to implement this part of the executive order. So the combination of both I think the public relations campaign and actual implementation has created important outcomes which we should, I think, lay out that we know of so far. First, arrests have gone up, certainly. From January to March, arrests of removable immigrants have gone up about 32%. About 21,000 people have been arrested from January to March. Arrests of people without a criminal record has doubled since January to March. And people with criminal records has gone up about 15% only. Removals, on the other hand, have gone down slightly, but that generally is an indication that it takes time for people to be processed from being arrested to actual removals. 3 new jurisdictions have signed up 287Gs. About 9 jurisdictions, as I said, have been warned that they are not in compliance. And on the other side of the ledger, if you look at apprehensions, since January to February, there have been increase about 40% in apprehensions, and from February to March, the decrease of 35% in apprehensions. If you look at the combined record, therefore, from January to March, there, as our handout indicates, about 62% decline in apprehensions at the border. So these are obviously big numbers. Now, if you look at the overall effect of some of these travel ban orders that were put in place, we're beginning to see evidence. We're seeing that there's a 20% decline in the flights coming from Emirates. The estimates are that there'll be 4.3 million fewer visitors who will come to the United States in 2017, which potentially has an impact of about $7.4 billion in our economy. About 6.3 million fewer will come in 2018, with about 10.8 billion impact on our economy. Reports of crimes have gone down in many parts of the country. Reports of domestic violence have gone down in many parts of the country. The number of foreign students applying to come to the United States is beginning to decline. This year, which we'll talk a little more about on the employment-based categories, only about 199,000 people applied for the H-1B visas. That's about 20% fewer than last year. So a combination of real evidence and what we believe is going to come out from what I believe is going to be an important part, the public relations component of this administration, is that it's soon going to be inescapable that certainly we are in a very different world in the enforcement of immigration. And clearly a different regime is in place. The last thing I want to say is that one thing that hasn't happened so far, which is sort of goes against what the president had promised in his election campaign, is that DACA has been left intact. The president had made executive actions of the prior president an important part of his campaign, that they were sort of ultra virus, the Constitution, and he hasn't touched DACA. Why that is and what the future of DACA is remains to be seen. Thank you.
Okay, well, Moose has put out a lot of numbers and point to trends, et cetera. I want to go to you, Julie, next, because at one point in your life, you would have been on the receiving end of some of these things.
That's right.
And so you know what it feels like, and you know what it takes to actually implement these kinds of policy changes. Moose has painted a picture of significant changes. Everyone is a priority. Talk to us and talk to the audience about how you see the implementation of these strategies and what you see is happening and what might be coming.
Absolutely, and I think Moose has done a great job in really kind of going through the executive orders and identifying some of the key pieces. And I want to thank you, Doris, and the Institute for putting this event together and inviting me to talk about, I think, this real time of change, and to focus first on interior enforcement. I think one of the most critical pieces of the Interior Enforcement Executive Order, and Musa kind of highlighted some of the key points, is the message that came out of the White House very early on in the administration, that interior enforcement is going to be a priority. During the Obama administration, an MPI report noted that in their final Obama priorities, 87% of the unauthorized population was not in Obama's priorities. So the message that was very clearly communicated was that if you come to this country without authorization, but you don't commit and get convicted of a serious felony, you will not be a priority in the Obama administration. Trump, however, and the Trump executive order have really done the opposite. It tells all the agencies, the border agencies, to employ all lawful means to ensure the faithful execution of immigration laws of the United States against all removable aliens. Not against just some removable aliens, not against a certain priority, but against all removable aliens. And I think that messaging is really something that is fundamentally different. Because when you start looking at what the activities are, the activities of the agency, of ICE and of CBP, are quite similar to the activities in the Obama administration, but the messaging is different. Obama said, famously, I think a few times, that words matter. Words matter, and I think here the message is kind of mattering and kind of sinking in as to who will be subject to potentially to removable and who will not. And I thought that it's very interesting to see this big decline in the initial portion of the Trump administration in terms of people coming in unauthorized, and it will be very interesting to see if that is a trend that continues. In terms of the day-to-day activities of ICE, the agency that I was in charge of when I was in the Bush administration, the focus remains the same. The focus remains on those that have been convicted of serious felonies, that have engaged in transnational gang activity, and pose a great public security threat to the United States. But if, and I think Musa touched on this as did Doris, if in executing their work on the priority group of unauthorized individuals, they run across another individual that has not yet been convicted of a serious crime or has not done something else, those individuals, under the executive order, the president has told them to apprehend those individuals as well, and to put those individuals into proceedings and to detain those individuals. And how can that affect things on a day-to-day basis? I think one of the best examples is to think about the program that DHS has to work in prisons and jails. It was originally called Secure Communities, then changed over to the Priority Enforcement Program during the Obama administration. And under that program, if someone is booked into a facility for any reason, if they're booked in and they're fingerprinted, it might be for something very minor, might be for something very serious, those fingerprints are then shared with the FBI, and that information is also shared with ICE. And then ICE can make a determination, do we need to do an interview of the individual to determine whether or not they're authorized in the U.S., or do we already know that they're not authorized, we have their fingerprints from the last time that they're deported. Under the Obama administration and the Priority Enforcement Program, if someone was booked in on a minor offense and the charges were dropped or they were not convicted of a very serious criminal offense, those individuals would not be in ICE's priority. And so in many instances, ICE would not apprehend those individuals for immigration proceedings. Now, under the Trump administration, those individuals, even if it's minor, even if the individual was arrested on something and the charges were dropped, those individuals will be turned over and have to deal with ICE under the Trump priority. So that is kind of, I think, a real difference. In terms of ICE's day-to-day work, ICE is not going to focus its work differently, not kind of stand outside on the street and just interview everyone that comes by. It's still going to target its operation on transnational criminal organizations, but if it's focusing on MS-13 gang members and it goes and does a targeted arrest at a certain place, but runs into someone that has no record, doesn't appear to be associated with the gang, but does appear to be unauthorized, they will arrest and apprehend that individual. So that's a real difference. I think another key difference is on 287G, and I think this is a real area to watch. And during the Obama administration, 287G had been kind of highly restricted to some very narrow areas within jails and prisons. Now, under this executive order, and then under some follow-on guidance from Secretary Kelly, 287G can be used wherever the agencies think it's effective, under the leadership, of course, of the Secretary. And it also, and I think this is very critical, can be used by Customs and Border Protection. They can employ, or Border Patrol can employ 287G. And this, in my opinion, is a real area to watch. Because while partnerships with state and locals can be extremely valuable and extremely productive, you've really got to make sure that there is the appropriate amount of training so that there's not abuse of this authority or it's used in an improper way. And so, I think for those who are worried about this sort of issue, you really should focus on what is CBP doing in this area and have they put the proper controls around the use and execution of 287G. Another area that is different with the focus on interior enforcement is the Attorney General. Attorney General Sessions and the pronouncements that he has already made with respect to what the prosecutors in the 94 sovereign districts are going to do with respect to immigration enforcement. Doris noted before we started today that already 52% of all federal criminal cases are immigration. Can that be increased? It absolutely can, and it absolutely can with the focus that Attorney General Sessions is putting on harboring cases. There are not that many of those cases that are brought, and also you can bring kind of more reentry cases. They may displace narcotics cases or other cases, postal fraud cases, other cases that might be seen as minor. What I saw when I was at ICE is that there were some U.S. attorneys that were very energetic about bringing immigration cases and others that did not want to do so at all. And during the period I was in the government, there was some focus on immigration prosecutions, but it was not a heavy objective of the Attorney General. Here, this is a priority of Sessions. It's been so while he was in the Senate. It's going to be so while he's the Attorney General. I think you're really going to see kind of an uptick in the work not only on the routine, the small cases, the reentry after removal, but actually targeting the large document fraud task forces, the smuggling rings, the international kind of illegal migration problems. And I think we'll see some real differences there. What are the challenges they're going to face? Huge challenges in funding. Under the executive order, which is, of course, not yet funded, nothing is funded yet, there are going to be 10,000 more ICE agents. with those 10,000, ICE will still have far fewer agents than the NYPD. And so yet, they are supposed to faithfully execute on all removable aliens. That's simply not, a sustainable goal. So I think a funding challenge for ICE, and not only ICE, but all throughout the immigration kind of life cycle. The judges, and while the Attorney General's talked about a modest increase in judges, I would say it's modest. Transportation, detention, the whole logistics, immigration attorneys, all of that must be increased if you are going to really ramp that up. I think public sentiment is also a challenge for kind of this rapid change in kind of attitude and perspective. They will really have to show that they're focusing on the more serious cases and not, not executing the laws in a willy-nilly kind of way. I think hiring those 10,000 people, even if you had the money for them, getting them through the background check process and getting really quality individuals is going to be a real challenge for them. I also want to talk very briefly about the executive order on Buy American, Hire American. I think one of the open questions on interior enforcement is what are they going to do with the magnet of work site, right? A magnet of working, because most people, when they come to the U.S., they come here to get a job, to help feed their families, to send money back home, etc. They don't come here to commit crime. The EO on Buy American, Hire American is, I think, the first salvo from the Trump administration on this. Interestingly, of course, although it talks about executing laws for all laws relating to entry of U.S. workers from abroad, it focuses in on the HB1 workers. So 85,000 people is who they're focusing in on. 85,000 per year, the HB1 kind of workers, and that is the high-tech workers. You may know of the Infosys case, the allegations relating to Disney and others, really focusing in on changing that program and on modernizing that program. Until the agencies and or Congress do something with that, USCIS has already started more targeted site visits on H-1Bs. So if you're an H-1B dependent employer, you ought to make sure that your kind of house is in order, that you are going through the process very effectively. If you are using some of the services that have H-1Bs kind of off-site, those will also be a priority for site visits. So you want to go through the files and make sure that you're doing that in an appropriate way. I think the open questions on hiring are E-Verify. Will it be made mandatory? 600,000 employers are using it. 20 states or so require it in some form. But right now, in the new budget, they're only requesting $15 million in improvements. Not enough to make it kind of nationwide. I think that's something we're hearing from the department that they're very interested in doing. If they get the support, that would make a lot of sense. You could potentially, get rid of the I-9, get rid of the employer focus, and really push to E-Verify, but remains to be seen. And then also traditional work site. I think it's a question about whether or not there will be I-9 reviews or other reviews of the non-high-tech workers. On sanctuary cities, I would just mention that, to add to what Musa said, that although they are requiring more data, they had started the decline detainer outcome report. That's an area where they didn't have good data, and it already became a problem kind of very quickly. And so I think this data gathering exercise is going to be quite a challenge.
That's a big list of things that are happening, and that administratively, as you've pointed out, really get more complicated as they unfold. So it certainly sets the table. Now, the other big issue here, of course, Stuart is going to talk about, and that has to do with border security, which ultimately was the lead concern and the lead campaign issue that brought Trump's candidacy so into the public eye. And of course, his answer was that we need a wall on the southwest border. And of course, the depiction of the illegal immigration problem for the country was one of people in the hundreds of thousands, millions spilling into the country who were a danger to the country. Stuart, talk to us about, and again, Stuart has had direct experience with this in the Department of Homeland Security in earlier years. Talk to us about the border security enforcement executive order and how you see border security unfolding in this administration, and particularly from the standpoint of the budget and the amounts of money that are being discussed here.
Well, first, thanks for the invitation. It's really a timely event, of course, and I appreciate all the comments before, and glad Julie got to handle the ICE part of it, which is the trickiest part sometimes. And I do think that there is it's accurate. This is the one area of policy that the president really did provide some detail on last year and even back into 2015, unlike tax or healthcare, where it's a little bit of open book. There were very specific promises made on building a wall, on turning ICE back on extreme vetting, on going after employer abuses and the like. And so no one should be really that surprised that this came out of the box this fast. Now, they've obviously run into a number of problems in trying to get from promises to action. I'll talk about the southern border infrastructure in a second. But you've had problems with the courts on the extreme vetting issue, which I'll come back to as very interesting kind of legal questions. The H-1B executive order, which was leaked right after the inaugural, what ended up coming out, I guess, last week, was not nearly as strong and kind of a conclusory as what had been rumored back in January. And then DACA, as was mentioned, was also something that came up quite a bit during the campaign that has been left untouched for the most part. And I think many people feel that could be essentially a chit to be traded later for things that the administration wants. I also think they always say, personnel is policy. In this case, it's interesting. You've kind of got, I call it like three groups of people making immigration policy in the administration. You've got the enforcement first and probably enforcement only crowd, led by the Attorney General, Mr. Sessions, Senator Sessions, and his advisors who are sprinkled kind of throughout the White House and through Homeland Security. And I honestly think, having heard him speak in his big keynote speech last week, I think Secretary Kelly at DHS really probably falls into this camp. His view is Congress wrote the laws. I'm in charge of them. I'm going to enforce them. And if you don't like them, Congress, you can fix them in any which way you want. In terms of enforcement, in terms of budgets, in terms of the like. So I think he probably falls into this first camp. The second is kind of, I'll call him the careerist camp. And it's interesting, with such a hot button set of issues, how many people that are essentially career people have now landed or are in line for very serious positions in the immigration kind of architecture. Kevin McAleenan, who's acting commissioner at Customs, has been nominated for the job. I think he's an incredible choice. There's bipartisan support for his work in the past as a lawyer at CBP, running a field office in LA, and then being head of field operations, and now the deputy and an acting commissioner. I've got a career individual running ICE, and apparently not a nomination likely to come to take over ICE. You've got essentially a career person been nominated to run USCIS. You've got careerists, I'd call them, at the DHS Chief of Staff and DHS Policy, Border Security Policy. Michael Dougherty, who's worked there, as well as the Hill, are all essentially career enforcement officials, not ideologues who came out of the states or came out of think tanks in particular. And then you've got kind of the crew that is yet to really appear on the battlefield, so to speak, but I'll call them, for this purpose, the Goldmanists. Wilbur Ross, like Goldman Sachs.
Goldman Sachs.
Who are the folks that, when they sit around the cabinet meetings, the deputies meetings, the principals meetings, are going to say, wait, there's an economic impact or foreign policy impact that we ought to consider here? And so we're all trying to figure out kind of what the relative power is of Wilbur Ross or Mnuchin, Gary Cohn. It looks like Michelle Lee, maybe running the Office of Science and Technology, which would have a role here. These are folks that care a lot about the economics around immigration, innovation, and also kind of what it would mean for the communities around the country. And I mean, mention kind of the family members, and the rumors, of course, are that the family members around this president had a lot to do with DACA not being abolished. So a lot of personnel fights that are very interesting. It's not nearly the crew that came in. There was a lot of rumors that Chris Kobosh was going to be deputy secretary or head of policy. That hasn't happened. That hadn't happened quite that way just yet. In terms of the budget and enforcement, it looks highly likely that the supplemental requests that came up for the wall and for other parts of the enforcement architecture are not going to happen, at least this week. There's not Democratic support. There's not Republican support to wage war on this and to risk shutting down the government right now. And then the request that came up for next fiscal year, which would have huge shifts within the DHS pie, away from the Coast Guard, away from TSA, away from grants to immigration, it's going to be very controversial. There's big constituencies for the Coast Guard. People don't want to pay more in TSA fees, and the politicians don't really want to vote for that. So I'm sure that there's going to be enhancements along the lines of, more for CBP, more for ICE, infrastructure and the like. But the press really misses the boat when the president says we're going to have 10,000 more ICE officers. Well, maybe you will, maybe you won't. Congress has a huge role to play. Those people are expensive. They've proven difficult to hire because of the background check issues. Same thing for CBP, and even more so for kind of the less sexy personnel people, the judges, the courts, the lawyers and the like that you need for the system to work if you're going to be really ramping up deportation. I think the big question is what happens when push comes to shove legislatively. There's a lot of rumors now, more than you might have expected, that there actually will be legislating on immigration on the Hill, not just the budget process, but authorizing legislation. That they want an E-Verify bill that would actually force employers to all employers to come to the table. That there's going to be proposals on the H-1B and employment visas that require legislative activity and not just regulatory. As I mentioned earlier, that DACA might be essentially a chit that could be traded for other things legislatively. There's going to be spending fights over the fence, over detention beds in particular, which are super expensive, that require some kind of negotiation around these other issues. And then getting back real fast to the extreme vetting and the border security issues, this has been really an interesting legal question. Having served over at DHS, the idea that somehow a court, or as Attorney General Sessions called it, a judge on some island, but any judge would be involved in the micromanagement of how we make border security determinations is really quite unusual. I remember when I was working at DHS and with State and with the FBI, it seemed like our power essentially was unlimited. And so you've got that train of thought, which is very deep in our case law, but then you have the religious test litigation. And so if you read the opinions in the Ninth Circuit, the Fourth Circuit, the Virginia case, and the Hawaii case, it's almost like they're barely looking at the same law. The opinions don't even talk about the same cases, the same legal authorities, and the like. So this is going to end up in the Supreme Court, I think probably sooner rather than later. And it's hard to bet, of course, but I think that any president's authority around the border is pretty robust, and I expect that the president will win. Interestingly, while there's been a lot of in the news about the laptop ban, other types of things that have made it more difficult for people to get here, they really have turned off the vetting kind of build out, the extreme vetting architecture. They have essentially put this on hold because of litigation. They've done other things, including ramping up the visa waiver program oversight and the like, but they're waiting to have the full authority of the courts to move forward aggressively. So we'll see how that plays out, but it's definitely something they're going to litigate, and I expect that they will win. And the question then will be, what does the administration decide they want to do? Do they really want to have more countries added to the visa ban? Do they want to bring the hammer down on visa waiver countries, which could have big economic impacts and also retribution on Americans traveling overseas? I think of it essentially, and having talked to Secretary Kelly about it a little bit, there's kind of four categories of folks. There's good visa waiver countries, the guys that we really work with well on intelligence and law enforcement. There's weaker VWP countries that they want to beat up and get into shape in terms of their information sharing requirements. There's the visa issuance country, which is most of the world, but they're very skeptical of, but have limited ability to tell them what to do. And then there's the refugee question, where there's clearly a belief that we really can't vet refugees, especially from war-torn countries, and that it's really just not worth the risk. So we'll see. I've been surprised a little bit how aggressive Secretary Kelly has been on working with the Attorney General on these issues. You know where the AG is, but he clearly has an ally in the new Secretary at DHS. And I think the big question moving forward is, who's the counter constituency? Is there somebody who is bringing an economic message, a foreign policy message to the immigration debate, or is it solely going to be the enforcement-only crowd that kind of carries the day? So with that, Doris, I'll throw it back. We got a lot to talk about. That covers about 1% of what's been going on.
Well, those are terrific opening comments, and I want to stick with you, Stuart, on a couple of points you made, because they really do start to surface the tensions and where some of the pulls may be and the trade-offs would have to come in. On the Congress and the Congress's role and the funding and possible legislation, I mean, you can't, tell what's going to come out of this at this point, but do you see, I mean, you're the first person I've heard say at this point that there
Uh-oh, that
might
doesn't sound
be.
good.
No, that there might actually be some potential for authorizing legislation, that one could actually get beyond the budget fights. But that probably, requires more bipartisanship than what it is that we've seen so far. How do you see this immigration debate play out as far as Democrats are concerned? And do you see, and this may be leaping very far ahead, but do you see Trump as a president on immigration? One could spin out a scenario of a Nixon goes to China kind of a dimension to all of this. Do you think that immigration is driving this administration sufficiently that Trump as a person and as a leader would actually try to look for substantive legislation, recognizing that it would have to go against the orthodoxies on each side and bring people together around a set of ideas, or is that far too ambitious?
Well, you would have lost a lot of money over the years if you bet on immigration reform passing. So I'm guessing if you're a betting person, you probably want to bet against it. But I guess there is a theory by which that there are certain things they need legislatively. They need money. They want a symbolic wall. It's not going to be everywhere. It's going to be part of the border. They need the enforcement regime. They need the beds. They need other things. The Democrats are going to have to go along with some of that if they want it. They need the experts will say they need an E-Verify bill. Without that, the draw of war continues. You're kind of left at defending the border, which really is not the place to do this. So there are things they need, and the question is, if the Democrats, if you're Chuck Schumer, if you're Pelosi, if you're Feinstein, and people like that, is there anything you're willing to negotiate with? Because the constituency, as you see with the Democrats moving further left and left and left, and I think the main thing here is that they thought they were going to win. It's a big difference, if we walked into election night and it was like, well, we're going to lose. Oh well, there goes immigration reform. It wasn't that. It was like, we're going to win and we're finally going to get it. Paul Ryan's going to cut a deal and we're going to finally have this big victory. So it's not that they lost; it's they lost and lost even worse than they thought. I don't know why, if I'm the Democrats, why I come to the table. I think you've played this out. You make the administration have the enforcement only regime as best they can for 4 years, and then you take it to the voters. That's my guess. If I'm a Democratic operative, which I am not, that's what I would do. And there's not enough conservative Democrats. There are a few. There's a few up for Senate seats and like they're going to want to vote for certain things, but it's hard to imagine that the Democratic establishment would say, yes, we should work with the president and give him all the enforcement tools he wants in exchange for some kind of half-baked, non-citizenship, not lesser enforcement kind of regime. But I welcome other people's thoughts on that.
I'm sure there are other thoughts on that. I want to pick up on the point that you made, Julie, about messaging and the really heavy emphasis on messaging and the switch that represents from the prior administration. And I'd like to ask all of you about messaging, because that is definitely a big part of what it is that we're seeing, the way that you, Moose, talked about the information that is being collected, the way in which that information, might be used. Do you see a situation here? How do I ask this question in a neutral way? I'm trying to get at what your views are of the messaging versus actually what's on the ground. Because as Stuart pointed out, if you don't get a lot of these new resources, and as you pointed out, even if you do get them, they're a year, 2 or 3 away in terms of actually being able to be dialing up the level of effort. Do we have a situation here where the messaging might actually be the success of these policies from the standpoint of those people who are embracing these policies?
I think some of the messaging, to be clear, I think some of the messaging, particularly during the campaign or at other points, has been far too aggressive and inappropriate, kind of in my view. However, I do think that there can be messaging that can discourage folks in other countries from coming to the U.S. And I think there is a role in that messaging, and I think that is that may be some of the success in the border decline is the messaging from my perspective, because as Stuart pointed out, you may not get the 10,000, and as I said, even if you do, that's only a little bit. So how are things really going to change? I think the other point that we have to always remain concerned about, especially those of us that care about enforcement as well, is how the messaging affects the vulnerable populations in the U.S. Here, and that's an area that I think is troubling. And I do think that the Secretary and others are kind of struggling with that as they try to figure out what to do with the DACA population or other places. And that's something that's kind of hard to reconcile. I think it's important to have a strong message for those out of the U.S. so they know, don't come here. If you come here, you won't get a job. You're going to be sent home. It's not going to be a lovely time for you. But for those who are here and out of status and we're working, I think that's a harder thing to kind of come up with what's the appropriate message.
Can I just mention one thing? I mean, hadn't quite come up. So I think, one of the media is focused on these cases where people have final orders of removal, but they're 10 years old, they're 20 years old, maybe they're 100 years old, who knows? And I think those are the ones that have really got people in a pickle, because these are, from ICE's point of view, these are people who have had their day in court. It's over. Like, the only thing that's left is to deport them. And yet, from an advocate point of view, these are folks who, since the final order was put in place, have built a family, have built a career, businesses, and the like, and it's totally, the two worldviews are completely separate. There really is no way to reconcile those, because the final order population is 800,000, 900,000.
Well, they stopped counting after a while, but yes,
It's large.
But they actually, though, in the Obama administration, they did weed through a lot of those more sympathetic cases and provided for ways for them to adjust or dismiss the cases, and so and use prosecutorial discretion, which is something we haven't really talked about. Is that really going to be the area where we're going to see a change? But I think there are fewer sympathetic cases now because of the great work that was done to weed out some of the inappropriate cases in the system. But I think Stuart's right. The media is always going to highlight, and others are always going to highlight those older cases.
Right.
The other thing I would just to add to what Stuart said earlier about immigration reform, I think the thing that's missing is, given the personnel he's laid out so far, there's no internal advocate for immigration reform, and I think you have to have that. And so I don't know if Secretary Kelly would end up being that, or if someone else.
Including something beyond enforcement.
Yeah, for reform. Right. Yes, yeah, including for a comprehensive immigration reform, or something that includes kind of broad-based reforms. I think you need an internal advocate, because it's so difficult. I don't think that you can do it without that, and I don't see in the players you list who that is, and that's something that's kind of missing at this point, and maybe to be one of the economic folks.
Mr. Kushner's in charge of foreign policy and domestic policy. He could handle immigration policy too. That'd be
okay. We'll talk. So I mean, let me just we'll ask Mr. Kushner soon, but I think let me just say both about messaging and about the last point made. First, I think this distinction between messaging and the narrative it creates. I mean, this president is all messaging. I mean, you have to say there was a huge component of his strategy during election. He knows how to message a thing. So it was not an accident that a core part of all these executive orders is collection of data and dissemination of data. That even if we all know that it will take a long time for these actions actually to hit the ground and produce results, that doesn't matter. The information that'll be collected and dissemination on a daily, weekly, monthly basis will create a feeling that a lot is being accomplished, which I think is a part of the president's agenda. Second is that despite you might think that this is all messaging, because there'll be a lot more noise than bite. In the immigrant community, this narrative has taken hold that if in the past, certainly towards the end of the Obama administration, that if you had not committed a serious crime, if you did not have a recent order removal, that you could actually have certain amount of predictability about your life, that you could leave in the morning, go back to work, and hope you will come back to see your kids. That, I think, understanding has vanished in the communities, and we all must recognize there's a palpable change in that recognition. Two, there are no longer any safe spaces. That people thought that if you show up for your court hearing, you will not be picked up. That if you even show up for your law enforcement scheduled meeting to meet with a parole officer, those spaces have gone. I mean, the chief judge of the New Jersey Supreme Court wrote a letter to Secretary Kelly last week. Please guarantee me that ICE agents will not be at New Jersey courts because it has happened. So I think
I'm
just
guessing they'll get a letter back saying,
we'll make you a sanctuary city. So these, you have to understand that that narrative really has taken hold, and that has created a feeling that this is just not noise. There's a lot and bite in what this administration's New Day in immigration is. I think the last thing I want to say about your point, Julie, is that you can see that to the extent there's an intellectual foundation in the agenda of this administration, it comes from the other end of the immigration stream. It comes from Attorney General Sessions when he was a senator. There was a handbook on immigration, which he published in 2015, which had nothing to do with candidate Trump or President Trump, in which he lays out his ideas about immigration, a lot of them to enforcement, none of them are about expansion of immigration issues. So you don't expect that to come from Senator Sessions. Those are all sort of hard-headed immigration proposals to make this, to shrink our legal immigration, to make immigration unwelcoming to large sort of sets of populations around the country. And frankly, you have to accept the Center of Immigration Studies has a huge imprint in this administration. You didn't mention about two major appointments: the chief advisor to the CBP acting commissioner, the chief advisor to the ICE director, are both former CIS officials, which do come also with a certain amount of philosophical attitude towards this.
Can I say one thing? I think it's very unfortunate that talking about the attitude on the H-1B executive order, that there was only either the draft one or the actual one. There's really only talk about the effect on existing American workers and very little talk about innovation. The United States is a place of innovation, building a tech economy, having the next tech innovation happen here and not Vancouver or in India. So, I mean, that's unfortunate. That's where, who is going to stand up within the Trump administration and say, no, it's not just about the 60-year-old engineer who we're worried about, who can't find a job, but worried about where is the next, 5,000 person company going to be headquartered. That's what we need to find out. But that's the main concern for me of the H-1B program, is not just about existing American workers, but the future American workers and future American companies.
I think that's exactly right, but I think that the problem is that there have been so many kind of perceived abuses, some of which because of the way the law is drafted, rather than how the companies kind of actually execute on that. But you have to have, frankly, a champion on that piece to stand up and say, we don't care just about these 85,000 workers coming in each year. We care about the bigger picture and where's innovation coming from next. I do want to pick up on the point on safe spaces, though. I think that's an area where the Obama administration successfully really shifted the narrative over time about where it's appropriate for ICE to engage in administrative arrests. And ICE had never engaged in arrests in churches. Always thought churches were not appropriate. Always believed schools were not appropriate. But now, if in the Obama administration, workplaces, if you don't arrest at workplaces, if you don't arrest at home, if you don't arrest at court, if you don't arrest at church, if you don't arrest, where is the appropriate place to arrest? And so I think that is, I think that discussion of kind of safe spaces and where is it appropriate for ICE to execute their mission, I think is an appropriate discussion point. And it can't be that ICE only has to make arrests out on the street where, frankly, there is more of a risk of threat to public safety or other sorts of problems. There've got to be kind of other places that are appropriate.
Well, it does raise the issue of jurisdictions that have declared themselves safe spaces. And that's, of course, a very big part of all of this, the places in the country where there are heavy concentrations of immigrants, both legal immigrant communities and obviously illegal immigrants, because we know that these take place in the same places. So what is your sense of the potency or ultimate outcome of the jurisdictions that are not going to cooperate and even go as broadly as the state of California, which at its state level is establishing sanctuary-like policies? How do you see that playing out? Is that effective? Are those, will that be a counterforce? And how far do you expect the administration might go in actually withholding funds, and is that a litigation issue? Stuart, I'd like to hear you talk about it as well, all of us.
It absolutely will be kind of a litigation issue, not only for the amount of funds, but really for kind of every step that the administration is going to take on the sanctuary city places. I think that it will, the Attorney General Sessions' actions and others will cause some jurisdictions to change, and we've seen kind of the differing public statements from Miami-Dade, for example, and other locations, and I think others will really kind of barrel in. And my concern is that at a practical level, even in places like Cook County or areas in California where there wasn't official cooperation, there was unofficial cooperation. And my concern is that given all the litigation and how political it's become, that the unofficial cooperation would really start to kind of fade away. And I think it's going to be very important for Secretary Kelly to figure out how can ICE and CBP have some unofficial cooperation so we can all do what we all care about, is keeping, the really dangerous public safety threats from kind of getting out on the street. And I think that's going to be one of their key focuses. I think this is going to be tied up in litigation, for years. It's going to be a lot of litigation, a lot of fights over, which grants are appropriate, how many grants, and then some of these jurisdictions don't care. They're just going to, kind of find another way to move on.
Yeah, I also expect there'll be a big Hill angle to this because eventually the money comes back to Congress, and most members are not going to want to cut off cities or even whole states from kind of law enforcement money that they use for programs that people like. So I expect you'll be in court first, and then you'll be on the Hill with some type of negotiation where localities will have to do the minimum cooperation probably to continue to receive kind of the typical Justice Department or Homeland Security funds. But I think this will play out kind of over a while. They're going to force people to do a little bit more, but probably not as fully cooperative as the Attorney General might like.
Is that, just very briefly, is that most states will produce evidence they're compliant with Section 1373.
Yeah.
That's sort of, this is a law that was written in 1996, and since then, not a single place has been found non-compliant. So that will tell you there's a history of a lot of compliance, or very difficult to establish non-compliance. Just on the legal issue, the argument says that it's definitely going to be litigated. There's just no doubt. There are already 5 jurisdictions in anticipation have brought lawsuits. So you can imagine what will happen when it's actually triggered. And here, the conservative judges on the Supreme Court all have spoken on the other side. There is the ACA case, there is the gun control case of the 1990s, where conservative judges have said that you actually cannot, if you want to withhold any fund, it must be really close to the basic purpose.
Right.
And it's hard to say what the purpose is. 2, you cannot use the fund as a gun to the heads of the states, because that would be a violation of the 10th Amendment. I think those are really important precedents that are going to hit the administration as it chooses to execute this particular section.
Can I switch? I know we're about to questions.
Let me ask one
Go ahead.
further
Sure.
point on this. In terms of the point you were making earlier about narrative, and how much the new narrative has grabbed at the community level. People really do understand and believe it's a different day. Do they believe in their sanctuary city?
This is classic case.
Protectors?
On this issue, this is a completely divided country. It's not an accident that, there are 33 states which, since President Trump got elected, have taken measures, either enacted legislation, process of enacted legislation, to make their subdivisions in conformity with. On the other hand, you have jurisdictions, state of California, top of the list, which have gone in the other direction, basically responded to the concerns of the constituents. My feeling is that trend is going to continue. My own assumption is that those states and jurisdictions ultimately will not be penalized, because either they will be seen as compliant, or the states will say that withholding fund is unconstitutional.
Just real fast. There's the 2 other programs we haven't mentioned, which I think are really important in terms of this border security mantra that I think are going to move forward over this year or next year. Is 2 things the 9/11 Commission recommended have not been fully built out. One is the Real ID program, which is finally going to hit the deadline next year. So if you are from a state that hasn't been willing to cooperate with the feds, you're not going to be able to use your license to fly. You're going to have to get a passport or something else. And then the exit program at airports in particular and seaports, where the technology is caught up and they're going to use facial recognition to check out people to make sure they're leaving on time and to identify imposters and the like. So both of those are good programs that have been stalled for a long, long time, partially for politics, partially because of federalism or spending issues, and partly because, just difficult. But they're moving forward, and these will be things that you'll see the president, the AG, the secretary out there talking about how we're securing the country, not just with rounding people up, but with these kind of, more identity management programs.
Okay, before we go to questions, let me ask one other round on each of you, which is what you raised, Stuart, about the economic impact and places within the administration where that might be of greater concern than the enforcement first. And the point you made about innovation, I mean, I think it's correct that every U.S. Nobel laureate this year is an immigrant. And so in terms of innovation and the role that immigration plays in the life of the country, as well as in the country being leading still around the world, this is a big economic issue. And the discussion has been entirely of enforcement and through an enforcement lens. There are some data now, and we've included them in this handout that is beginning to come from the travel industry about the amount of revenue loss that is already being experienced and that can be projected. How do you see the economic pushback that has always been a tension in this issue and has in the past and in many of our personal experiences actually frustrated enforcement significantly? How do you see that coming, and is that going to be a counterforce, or is this really going to continue to be single-minded in the way that we've seen?
I think it's too early to tell. The travel industry, and I should be clear here, speaking for myself, not for clients, has more or less held their fire to some extent on these issues, waiting to see what the impact was, and the numbers aren't really in yet in terms of what the impacts are. We obviously know the anecdotes. It's been the tech industry that's been the one kind of fighting the main battle for the economic issues, either because of actual impact or just perceived, kind of fairness issues. So I expect you will see more and more business interests stepping up on whether it's student issues in universities, the travel industry, the technology industry, and even manufacturers care about having customers be able to get here to look at their tractors and the like. So we'll see. The question is within the administration, who is going to make that case? And if they've been making it so far, it's been very quiet. And perhaps that's a smart move in a administration that bears its disagreements pretty openly. So we'll see. I don't think we know yet, but the travel industry will step up if the numbers come in poorly. The tech industry already has, and the question is, can they find supporters that matter within those interagency debates all the way up to the president?
I think also kind of on the student side, the schools are really going to be looking and thinking about this, as students may not want to come here if they think there won't be an opportunity kind of later on, or that they'd be discriminated against when they come here just because they're on a student visa. I think one thing that could be helpful actually is the new technology that is making enforcement more effective. And so instead of just kind of going out and picking people up or arresting people, if you do have an exit that has facial recognition and you do have kind of more sophisticated things, if we start to have an immigration system that is more regular and more orderly, there could be more confidence in that system, which could lead to, I think, I would hope would lead to an immigration bill. Certainly we've seen on the export control side, as we tried to keep very sensitive dual use and military goods from countries like China without licenses and things, what they've done is they've developed their own. And so we don't want to kind of copy that model on immigration, that where, instead of people coming to the U.S., they just want to go someplace else where they can invent their things and do good work.
And I might just mention one other thing. Later this year, the decision for the 2024 Olympic Games is going to be made between Paris and Los Angeles. And, the U.S. openness is a big factor in that deliberation. So, and the president has been very supportive of the L.A. bid. And so we'll see if that is a factor in how they treat these types of issues.
Interesting point. Okay.
Just very quickly on the point, I was very intrigued by what Stuart said, that DHS takes the ban against extreme wedding seriously. That's really, despite the fact that it's been enjoined, the narrative is that you should not come. And that's when you see legal immigration going down. It's not just unauthorized immigration at the border. You know that the narrative has set in, even though people are not directly affected by policy.
That's right. That's why the industry's big ask right now is to couple your tough on security message with a welcome message. We want you to come if you're a legitimate traveler, a business person, a tourist, a student. That has gotten missed to some extent by the administration so far, but it's that they don't have to be mutually exclusive.
Yeah, so the last point I'm talking about is their prospect. We all agree, I think, that so far, this administration has gotten its sort of intellectual foundation of its immigration policy from two quarters. And the issue is, are the Goldmanists in Stewart's wing going to be on the ascendancy, or are the Sessions or the CIS will continue to dominate the narrative of this administration? And I think that's which way that fight goes is going to determine whether we'll see anything beyond simple enforcement.
You can do that with the 200-day panel.
All right, before we go to the 200-day panel, we want to involve the audience in the 100-day panel. So I'm going to wait for the microphone to come around, and please tell us who you are, and then happy for your question.
Jose Diaz-Asper from the NLM Group. I really enjoyed the conversation, but to add to the economic discussion, Mexico is one of our most important trading partners, and the message now is, they're going to China to set up trading agreements. I mean, the investors, there's a lot of ties here that I'm familiar in Spain when the European Union let Spain come in and added not only the ability to trade, but there was a law that allowed a convergence factor. We want to build strong communities in the other side so that these people don't continue to have to come. So I was wondering if you could touch upon that.
Who'd like to take that?
No, I think you're right. I think everyone realizes our relationship with Mexico is incredibly important for economic reasons, for cultural reasons, and the like. I think the question is, can you kind of put the wall and kind of enforcement over here, and then keep the other issues, law enforcement, cooperation, trade, those types of things, kind of in another bucket, or are they all too intermingled? And I don't think we quite know yet what the Mexican government response needs to be. We know they're under tremendous pressure to kind of meet force with force. And the business community in Mexico is trying very hard to figure out a way to work quietly and privately on NAFTA issues and the like to try to turn the temperature down. In some ways, all the fighting over extreme vetting and Muslim ban and laptops and stuff has kind of distracted a little bit the Mexican conundrum and fight. So, I don't know, maybe there's only air in the room for one fight at a time, and right now it's not Mexico. So we'll see.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, I think that Mexico is in a sort of a stasis at this point.
Mm-hmm.
There was so much talk and so much concern, but it seems that it's either a loss of attention or it's a little bit more maturity about what really is possible. But I think that it's kind of.
Yeah, but there are two things about Mexico which we didn't touch in the context of executive orders. One is that the president still keeps on saying that Mexico will pay for the wall. They just haven't received the bill. So obviously Mexico is still on at least the rhetorical sort of out there. But I think this other stuff is the border. One of the elements of the border order was that we can ask Mexico to hold people in their country while we are doing processing for the removal. And that Mexico has now clearly rejected,
Right.
that they're not going to do it.
Right, so, yes, in the back.
Hi, my name is Miriam Barcelon. I'm a journalist for EFE News, Spanish news wire. And I wanted to ask how you've talked about the narrative changing. Are we going to see that translated into the next 4 years or 8 years in an increase of deportations compared to the Obama administration? Thank you.
Actually, let me, we have a Twitter question on that as well, so let me add that to it and ask you to take it, Julie. And the Twitter question is there really much change when you look at the overall 2009 to 2014 or Obama administration record and what it is that we're seeing now. What is your sense of how this is going to play out?
Well, certainly, I think you're going to see more deportations from the interior of the country versus kind of at simply individuals that were apprehended within 100 miles of the border, because there's more interior enforcement. And we've also seen, much reduced numbers in terms of family groups kind of coming over and into the U.S. But one thing that I do think is interesting on the narrative is that what Secretary Kelly is actually doing, even if you look at the proposals relating to the wall, it's pretty nuanced. It's saying, let's look at, 71 miles of area where there was a problem, and let's focus on that. And for enforcement, let's focus on these nuanced things. And so I think one question that I have in terms of the narrative is, are we going to still have kind of the White House narrative, which was kind of overbroad, all bad hombres, or is it going to be, more nuanced narrative? Here's how we're going to deal with kind of transnational crime that's going to be more targeted. And I think if you start to hear Secretary Kelly speak, I think he is more nuanced. And so if they allow him to go out, I think the narrative will become kind of more precise. Longer term, part of the reason that you had huge numbers of deportations or turnarounds at the border kind of in the old days is some people would come into the U.S. 10 times a night, right? And so, you want, so sometimes the numbers are deceiving, regardless of how much data you try to give.
I think you also see a increasing connection to transnational criminal groups and the drug problem, and not just kind of a cocaine type of problem, but the opioid problem. Because I think the Trump folks realized that this was a huge problem for the last administration. They've got a limited amount of time until it becomes their problem. You got a situation where over 50,000 people a year are dying. The numbers are incredible and horrific, and the border aspect of that is something that Secretary Kelly, as a DOD guy, is very focused on. So it won't just be about immigration per se. It's around border management, border security, and the drug issue as well.
And in fact, you begin to see a bit of that shift in the language already, which would be consistent with the numbers going down so significantly on people crossing the border. Over here.
Hi, Patricia Laya from Bloomberg News. There seems to be a real concern at the Department of Labor that H-2B employers aren't making a real effort to find U.S. workers. The Office of the Inspector General has mentioned this several times. Have you seen any evidence of this? Is this a valid concern? Thank you.
Try that, Moose. You don't.
Julie should.
Julie should do it? Okay. Julie should do
She's
it.
saying H-2B?
H-2B, right.
Yeah. I don't know if you.
Well, I think actually that was part of the original executive order, the leaked draft that was back in January. There was H-2B and other worker programs besides H-1B were in that, and they kind of fell out along the way for reasons that aren't really known. There's no labor secretary yet. He's going through confirmation now, but I assume that once he arrives, that will be part of the what was it? Hire America, Buy America. I need an acronym for that. HACA. That'll be part of what they're looking for. It's not just H-1Bs. There's other programs that people care about, and that I expect will be one of them. It's not.
Yes, Jose Diaz with Reforma newspaper from Mexico. Regarding the messaging and the decrease in apprehensions in these past months at the border from people from Central America, what's your take on it? I know it's the most difficult thing, whether this is just temporary or a long-term trend. Does the tough talk works?
I think it's too early to see whether it's going to be a long-term trend. This is the time of year, as you know, there's a seasonality in terms of migration to the U.S. This is the time of year where we're expecting it to go up. It is promising to see this drop, at the border, and I think messaging has to be kind of a part of the reason that there is this drop at the border, kind of with all the attention there. Given illegal migration is always very complex. There can be other factors that we're not yet aware of that could be kind of weighing in, as well as economics in home countries or other things. But I think from my point of view, I think the messaging is a part of it.
No, there's a market here like there is for everything else, and we've been told that the prices for smuggling operations have skyrocketed because it's harder, and so people are asking for more money. So there's a market dynamic to this, just like everything else.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of trends, I mean, you have to acknowledge the trend that for last 17 years at least, my apprehensions seem to go up in this season. It's for the first time that in the period from January to March, we have seen a huge decline. And that's both with respect to Central Americans who were crossing and non-Central Americans who were crossing. So it's a clearly across the board decline. So it has to be something related to the messaging.
But let me just add that I do think it's fair to say that in the case of Central American migration, which is a mixed flow, and a good deal of that migration is brought about by violence and refugee-like conditions. The question, I think, how temporary, or whether this is a temporary wait-and-see phenomenon, or whether this is the beginning of a trend. And we won't know until that plays itself out a little further. Any other in the room? I do have somebody on Twitter, but let's take this other person in the room. Kathleen.
Kathleen Newland from the Migration Policy Institute. You've mentioned the sort of losers from some of these policies as being universities, tourism industry, technology industry. You could add perhaps healthcare, agribusiness. I wonder if you would comment on those two also. But these add up to great big chunks of the U.S. economy. And I just wonder if it is really going to be just up to the Goldmanites in the administration to push back on this, or would you expect that you would relatively soon start seeing political action on the part of these industries that are harmed by new immigration policies?
Over the last 10 years, many of these industries have engaged in Hill activity or other things to show that aggressive enforcement policies are bad for business and don't make sense, and they don't have the workers that they need without at times employing workers that are unauthorized. I think what is very interesting is that so far what the president has said relating to employment has been pretty narrow. Has said, let's look at all the visa categories for workers who come in abroad. That's a kind of a general statement, which could include obviously the H-2Bs, but then he focuses on the H-1Bs, the tech workers, and not really on any other segment. And I don't think that is by accident. I think that there is that's already perhaps a narrowing on the employment piece, perhaps until they decide what they will do with E-Verify or some other point. But it was simply too obvious not to have more mention of worksite enforcement or E-Verify, and not to have that in any of the executive orders so far was surprising, and I think is sending a message about the importance of the economic justification. But I'd be interested if Stuart, what he thinks on that.
I think we're still waiting. I mean, the folks who were pushing hardest for comprehensive immigration reform in the low wage sector, so the chamber kind of at the top of the heap, but the restaurants, the roofers, the landscaping, construction, healthcare, and the like. I mean, they don't seem to be super active right now on that. I think part of it is they've got a lot of other fish to fry. They're working on labor issues. They're working on tax reform. They've got a huge fight on trade underway that's not that business friendly. So, you can only fight so many battles at one time with the same administration. And I guess to the most part, they've decided to take a walk for now on this. But if there's legislation moving, I'm sure they'll engage. And I believe it's something they'll return to. It's just not everything can be your top priority when there's so many lines in the fire right now.
Any other questions in the room? I have one on Twitter. Okay, the Twitter question is, what's been the biggest disconnect between the rhetoric and the action? And I'm struck by a couple of things that have been said here that represent disconnects. One, you raised, Stuart, which is the desire to have the Olympics be in the United States at the time where the narrative is this is no longer a welcoming place. Another one that's of course been pointed out is the sympathy for what happened to the victims of the gas attacks in Syria, leading to bombing strikes, but a prohibition on Syrian refugees being resettled in the United States, and your view that there's a sense that no refugee can be, reliably vetted to come into the United States. Are there other disconnects that might start to be more and more uncomfortable over time?
I guess if you're going to just find disconnect, bro, I think the biggest disconnect is the way the press is covering some of this stuff, because they're covering proposals as outcomes. They're covering anecdotes as everywhere. And, they're really, and in many cases, there isn't enough data out there to kind of generalize on what's going. Do we know for a fact that the executive order on travel and refugees has killed the numbers of travelers to come to the United States? We don't know that. It may be, but the numbers aren't in yet. And so, I think it's a lot of kind of guessing and trying to, essentially, you have your position on immigration, and now you're laying that on top of what the president and his team are doing and coming to the conclusion that you want. Again, I really encourage people to read the Ninth Circuit opinion on the refugee executive order and the dissent, because it's almost like they're not even involved in the same case.
I think Stuart's right on the messaging. I think also in terms of the personnel that have been put in place at DHS, there are, I think starting with Secretary Kelly and kind of all the way down, there are a number of very kind of reasonable, nuanced, kind of thoughtful individuals. They're not recognizing that CIS has put in some folks as special assistants. People that are the heads of the agencies are not ideologues on immigration or on border things, but they're kind of thoughtful people. And I think there's a perception that they're different. So I think that's a big disconnect. I also think the failure to account really for the employment magnet and focusing solely on the H-1B program is a disconnect in terms of really reforming immigration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How about you?
Well, I think on the positive side, the disconnect has been on the DACA. I mean, I think that was a very important message the president said early on, and it's quite clear that he has understood the reality of the DACA kids in a very different way than he understood as a candidate. Mm-hmm. And that's a good development. And we hope that voices like that will prevail in the administration as it handles things beyond DACA.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, let me bring this to a close by asking a final question, and that is to get back to the 100 days. The 100 days is an important marker. It leads to report cards from all kinds of places on all kinds of things, totally apart from agreement or disagreement with the policies and with the executive orders and the mandates that have been given. What's your report card on the 100 days? Stuart.
Yikes. Can we turn off the tape, please? No, I think if you're the president and his team and you're thinking, what did we promise we would do? For the most part, they've delivered on the various aspects of immigration that they either are underway or have tried to push forward. So if you're them, you're happy, you give yourself a self grade of a B+, and I'll leave my own opinion to myself.
I like the self-grade model. This is why you always follow a lobbyist when you're at these. I think that the apprehensions dropping and the low in terms of individuals coming into the U.S., that kind of record low right now that they're seeing, I think they would give themselves a B+, A- for that, even though they've had some other stumbles. At the end of the day, fewer people are coming to the country without authorization. I think they would call that a win.
The thing is that if you straight go against what the president had promised himself in the election campaign, I think he could say he tick-marked a number of those issues. Whether all of them will actually have the impact that he wants to have, we don't know as yet. But I think in a very short period of time, he has changed the narrative that this is a different regime in the world of immigration. And it's a different day for the lives of immigrants in this country.
Okay, you can draw your own conclusions. Thanks very, very much for being with us today. Let me remind you that we have lots of resources in the hallway on the shelf as you leave. Check our website for many more of them, migrationpolicy.org. And then I'd like to also remind you that Thursday, May 4th, a week from this Thursday, we will have another event, and we will be looking specifically at the southwest border and what's taking place at the southwest border. So we hope to see you again. Thanks very much for being with us.